At 9 o'clock in the evening on December 7th, 1941, a small black portable radio sat on the dining table at Chequers, the British Prime Minister's country residence in Buckinghamshire. The Tudor-era manor house had witnessed many historic moments since it became the official country retreat of British Prime Ministers in 1921, but none would rival what was about to unfold. Winston Churchill reached for the device, a gift from Harry Hopkins, Roosevelt's closest advisor. He flipped open the lid slowly, too slowly, and the first headlines had already begun. The BBC newsreader Alvar Liddell led with a report on a tank battle in Libya, south of Tobruk. Then came the words that split history in two. Japanese aircraft had raided Pearl Harbor, the American naval base in Hawaii. The announcement had come from President Roosevelt himself. For a moment, the 8 people seated at the dinner table fell completely silent. The candles flickered. The evening air hung heavy with the weight of what they had just heard. Then Churchill's transformation was instantaneous. The depression that had shrouded him throughout the meal vanished. He slammed the top of the radio down and jumped to his feet, striding toward the door with the announcement that Britain would declare war on Japan. Ambassador John Winant, the American envoy seated at the table, followed him out of the room into the great hall. "Good God," Winant said. "You cannot declare war on a radio announcement." Churchill stopped and looked at Winant, half seriously and half quizzically. "What I shall do?" he asked. It was not genuine uncertainty, but a courtesy to the representative of the nation under attack. Winant understood. "I will call up the president by telephone and ask him what the facts are," he said. "And I shall talk with him too," Churchill added. Within minutes, a transatlantic telephone call connected Churchill to the White House. The exchange that followed would become one of the most quoted conversations of the Second World War. The line crackled with static as the voices travelled across 3,000 miles of ocean. "Mr. President," Churchill said, "what is this about Japan?" "It is quite true," Roosevelt replied. "They have attacked us at Pearl Harbor. We are all in the same boat now. This certainly simplifies things," Churchill answered. "God be with you." Winant then took the receiver and asked whether ships had been sunk. Roosevelt, aware he was speaking on an unsecured line, was circumspect. He confirmed losses, but offered no precise count. The full scale of the catastrophe: 5 battleships sunk, 2,400, 3 killed, 1,178 wounded, 188 aircraft destroyed, would emerge only gradually over the following days. That night, while those 2,400 Americans lay dead in the smoking wreckage of Battleship Row, while the USS Arizona burned with 1,177 men entombed in her hull, while families across the United States would soon receive telegrams bearing the worst news imaginable, Winston Churchill retired to his bed at Chequers and slept soundly. He later wrote that he was saturated and satiated with emotion and sensation, and that he slept the sleep of the saved and thankful. It was perhaps the only restful night any leader in the English-speaking world experienced that December evening. To understand why Churchill felt relief rather than horror, one must grasp the desperate reality Britain faced in December 1941. The nation was not merely struggling, it was approaching the limits of what a single island power could sustain against a continental enemy that had conquered nearly all of Europe. Every week brought new crises. Every month depleted reserves that could not be replenished. Churchill had become Prime Minister in May 1940, inheriting a war that had already begun to turn against the Allies. Within weeks of taking office, he watched France collapse with stunning speed, the British Expeditionary Force evacuate from Dunkirk's beaches under constant air attack, and the threat of German invasion loom over the English Channel. For 17 months after the fall of France, Britain had fought alone. The Royal Air Force had won the Battle of Britain in the skies over southern England, shooting down German aircraft at a rate that forced Hitler to postpone Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. But victory in the air only meant survival, not triumph. The threat remained. The bombing continued. The Blitz had killed more than 43,000 British civilians. Night after night, Londoners sheltered in underground stations, while German bombers rained destruction on their city. German submarines were strangling the Atlantic lifelines that kept Britain fed and armed. The Battle of the Atlantic was the crisis Churchill feared most. He later wrote that the only thing that really frightened him during the war was the U-boat peril. Britain required more than 1 million tons of imported material every week to survive and continue fighting. Food, oil, steel, aluminum, rubber. Nearly everything the war machine needed had to cross the Atlantic, running a gauntlet of German submarines, surface raiders, and long-range aircraft. In 1940, German U-boats alone had sunk more than 560 merchant ships, carrying approximately 2.2 million gross tons of vital supplies. When losses from aircraft, surface raiders, and mines were added, total Allied shipping losses that year approached 4 million tons. Britain could build only 1.25 million tons of replacement shipping per year. At those rates of loss, a quarter of the entire merchant fleet would vanish within 12 months. More than 30,000 men of the British Merchant Navy would die before the war ended, many of them drowning in oil-slicked waters or burning in torpedoed tankers. The Atlantic was an open wound that only American industrial power could close. In the Far East, the situation was about to become catastrophic. Japan attacked British Malaya less than 8 hours after Pearl Harbor. On December 10th, just 3 days after the American disaster, Japanese aircraft sank HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse off the Malayan coast. These were 2 capital ships sent to deter Japanese aggression, and their destruction in a matter of hours demonstrated the terrifying power of air attack against naval vessels. Churchill called the loss of these ships one of the most direct and painful shocks he suffered in the entire war. Singapore, supposedly an impregnable fortress, would fall on February 15, 1942, in what Churchill himself called the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. Approximately 80,000 British, Australian, and Indian troops would surrender to a smaller Japanese force. In North Africa, the situation offered little comfort. Operation Crusader, the Eighth Army's first major offensive, was grinding forward with mixed results. The commanding general, Alan Cunningham, had recommended breaking off the battle entirely before being relieved by General Auchinleck. Tobruk had finally been relieved on November 27th, after a siege lasting 231 days, but Rommel's Afrika Korps remained potent and would counterattack devastatingly in January 1942, driving the British back across hundreds of miles of desert. On the Eastern Front, the Wehrmacht had killed or captured more than 3 million Soviet soldiers within 3 months of Operation Barbarossa. German forces stood at the gates of Moscow, close enough that advance patrols could see the spires of the Kremlin. If the Soviet Union fell, Churchill faced the prospect of fighting a Germany that controlled the resources of an entire continent from the Atlantic coast to the Ural Mountains. Britain was already shipping tanks and supplies to the Soviets via dangerous Arctic convoys to Murmansk and Archangel, while American Lend-Lease would eventually deliver nearly 15,000 aircraft to the Soviet Union through multiple routes, further straining Allied resources. Each convoy that sailed the Arctic route faced German submarines, aircraft based in Norway, and some of the most brutal weather conditions on Earth. Britain's finances were exhausted. Under the American Neutrality Acts, Britain had been paying cash for all supplies, rapidly depleting gold and dollar reserves. By the end of 1940, Britain had spent more than $4.5 billion and had virtually nothing left. Churchill's famous letter to Roosevelt on December 8, 1940, often called the most important letter of the Second World War, laid bare the crisis with brutal honesty. "The decision for 1941 lies upon the seas," Churchill wrote. "Unless we can establish our ability to feed this island, to import munitions of all kinds which we need, we may fall by the way." He warned bluntly that Britain was running out of money. "The more weapons and ships you send us, the faster our money is spent. Very soon we will not be able to pay for the shipping and supplies." General Alan Brooke, then Commander-in-Chief of Home Forces, captured the exhaustion of Britain's military in an October 1941 diary entry. "The flower of our manhood was wiped out some 20 years ago," he wrote, referring to the catastrophic losses of the First World War, "and it is just some of those that we lost then that we require now. Half our corps and divisional commanders are totally unfit for their appointments, and yet if I were to sack them I could find no better." Britain had lost virtually all its heavy equipment at Dunkirk and had been at war for 27 months, with forces committed across 4 continents. The army was stretched thin. The Navy was fighting on multiple oceans. The RAF was defending Britain while also supporting operations in North Africa and the Middle East. This was the weight Churchill carried on the evening of December 7th, 1941, and it explains why the dinner at Chequers that Sunday night found him in such a dark mood. The previous evening had been livelier, almost festive by wartime standards. Saturday had been a birthday celebration for Kathleen Harriman, daughter of Roosevelt's Lend-Lease envoy Averell Harriman, who was turning 24. Churchill had toasted her warmly and presented an autographed copy of his early book The River War, a gesture of affection and perhaps a subtle reminder of his long career in war and politics. Clementine Churchill had been present on Saturday, but by Sunday she was unwell and did not come downstairs for dinner. The Sunday gathering was markedly more sombre. 8 people sat at the table in the large dining room, the walls lined with portraits of former prime ministers and their families. Churchill occupied his customary seat. Averell Harriman sat nearby, his presence a constant reminder of the American connection Churchill was so desperately trying to strengthen. Ambassador John Winant, the gaunt and idealistic American envoy to Britain, had come from London. General Hastings Ismay, Churchill's chief military advisor, whom everyone called Pug, was there as always. Commander Tommy Thompson, Churchill's naval aide-de-camp, attended to military matters. John Martin, the Prime Minister's principal private secretary, stood ready to handle any paperwork or communications. Kathleen Harriman added youth and American charm to the gathering. And Pamela Churchill, the Prime Minister's daughter-in-law and estranged wife of his son Randolph, completed the party. Harriman recalled the scene vividly in his memoir years later. The Prime Minister seemed tired and depressed. He did not have much to say throughout dinner and was immersed in his thoughts, with his head in his hands part of the time. This was unusual. Churchill typically dominated any gathering with his wit, his anecdotes, his boundless energy for conversation. To see him withdrawn and silent unsettled his guests. The reason for his gloom was strategic and entirely specific. Intelligence reports indicated Japan was about to strike somewhere in the Pacific. British codebreakers had been tracking Japanese military communications. The question that haunted Churchill was not whether Japan would attack, but where. His nightmare scenario was that Japan would attack only British possessions in Malaya and the Dutch East Indies, dragging Britain into a Pacific war without triggering American intervention. That very morning, he had received encouraging word that Roosevelt planned to announce within 3 days that Japanese aggression against British or Dutch territory would be considered a hostile act against America. Churchill had telegraphed General Auchinleck with visible relief. This is an immense relief, as I had long dreaded being at war with Japan without, or before, the United States. But nothing was certain. Roosevelt had made promises before, and been unable to deliver them due to congressional opposition. The dread hung over dinner like a fog. Churchill barely touched his food. He stared into space. He rested his head in his hands. The man who had inspired a nation with his defiance sat that evening in something close to despair. At approximately 9 o'clock British time, roughly 4 o'clock in Washington and nearly 8 hours after the first Japanese bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, Churchill's valet Frank Sawyers carried the small black portable radio into the dining room. It was a gift from Harry Hopkins, delivered months earlier as a gesture of American friendship. Sawyers placed it on the table and withdrew. Churchill opened the device slowly, missing the opening headlines. The BBC led with Libya, the fighting around Tobruk, the advances of the Eighth Army. Then the newsreader's tone shifted, and the words came that would change everything. Harriman was the first to react. He was thoroughly startled and repeated the words aloud. The Japanese have raided Pearl Harbor. The name of the American naval base hung in the air, but Commander Thompson misheard. No, he interrupted firmly. He said Pearl River. A brief argument ensued, almost absurd given the stakes. Thompson insisted he had heard Pearl River, which was a plausible confusion since Pearl River was both an estuary near Pearl Harbor and a town in New York. For perhaps 30 seconds, the fate of nations hung on a semantic dispute. At that moment, Sawyers reappeared at the door. "It is quite true," the valet announced. "We heard it ourselves outside. The Japanese have attacked the Americans." Simultaneously, John Martin appeared to report that the Admiralty was on the telephone with confirmation. Churchill's lethargy vanished instantly. He slammed the radio shut and rose from the table with a speed that surprised his guests. He strode toward the door, announcing his intention to declare war immediately. Winant followed. urging caution about making such a declaration based solely on a radio bulletin. The two men stood in the Great Hall, the American ambassador trying to impose procedural restraint on the British Prime Minister's instinctive combativeness. Within minutes, the transatlantic call connected Churchill to Roosevelt. The conversation was brief but historic. Roosevelt confirmed the attack. "We are all in the same boat now," the president said. Those 6 words contained everything Churchill had worked toward for 18 months. After the call, Churchill wrote that he tried to adjust his thoughts to the supreme world event which had occurred, which was of so startling a nature as to make even those who were near the centre gasp. He and Harriman composed a joint message to Harry Hopkins, who was ill in Washington. "Thinking of you much at this historic moment. Winston, Averill." Churchill described the reaction of his 2 American guests with characteristic precision. "My 2 American friends took the shock with admirable fortitude," he wrote. "They did not wail or lament. They wasted no words in reproach or sorrow. In fact, one might almost have thought they had been delivered from a long pain." Harriman confirmed this reading. "The inevitable had finally arrived," he wrote in his memoir Special Envoy to Churchill and Stalin. "We all knew the grim future that it held, but at least there was a future now. We both had realized that the British could not win the war alone. On the Russian front, there was still question whether the Red Army would hold out. At last, we could see a prospect of winning." Churchill's own reflection on that evening, written in his memoir The Grand Alliance, 9 years later, remains one of the most extraordinary passages in 20th century political writing. Its emotional honesty is startling. He opened with a plea for understanding. "No American will think it wrong of me if I proclaim that to have the United States at our side was to me the greatest joy." He then offered his strategic calculation. "I could not foretell the course of events. I do not pretend to have measured accurately the martial might of Japan, but now at this very moment I knew the United States was in the war, up to the neck and into the death." Then came the line that captures the full emotional force of that night. "So we had won after all." What followed was a catalogue of survival. Dunkirk, the fall of France, the agony of Oran, the threat of invasion, the Blitz, the U-boat war, 17 months of lonely fighting. All compressed into a passage that reads like a man who had been holding his breath for 2 years and could finally exhale. He declared with certainty that England would live, Britain would live, the Commonwealth of Nations and the Empire would live. He cited a remark from 30 years earlier that the United States is like a gigantic boiler, and once the fire is lighted under it, there is no limit to the power it can generate. Churchill's verdict on the Axis powers was absolute. Hitler's fate was sealed. Mussolini's fate was sealed. As for the Japanese, they would be ground to powder. He calculated that the British Empire, the Soviet Union, and the United States together represented twice or even thrice the force of their antagonists. He did not ignore the cost ahead. He acknowledged terrible forfeits in the East and immeasurable cost and tribulation still to come, but none of it mattered against the central fact. Survival was now assured. How long the war would last or in what fashion it would end no man could tell, nor did I at this moment care. The relief Churchill felt on December 7th was proportional to the years of effort and frustration that preceded it. From the day he became Prime Minister in May 1940, drawing the United States into the war had been his single most important strategic objective. Everything else, the battles in North Africa, the defense of Britain, the aid to the Soviet Union, was secondary to this supreme goal. British security coordination in New York operated under a directive from Churchill himself. American participation in the war is the most important single objective for Britain. The Churchill-Roosevelt wartime correspondence would eventually encompass approximately 1,700 to nearly 2,000. Communications, letters, telegrams, telephone calls, one of history's most consequential diplomatic exchanges. Churchill wrote Roosevelt 2 or 3 times a week, crafting each message with the care of a novelist courting a reluctant publisher. He weighed every word, knowing that a misplaced phrase could set back months of careful diplomacy. He addressed Roosevelt as a friend and equal, though privately he sometimes seethed at American caution. The relationship was asymmetric. Churchill needed Roosevelt far more than Roosevelt needed Churchill, and both men knew it. The courtship proceeded in stages, each one bringing America incrementally closer to war. Just 5 days after becoming Prime Minister, on May 15, 1940, Churchill made his first major request. He asked Roosevelt for the loan of 40 or 50 of your older destroyers to help combat the submarine menace. Roosevelt initially refused. Ambassador Joseph Kennedy was reporting from London that Britain's surrender was inevitable. Why send ships to a sinking nation? The eventual destroyers for bases deal of September 1940 transferred 50 aging World War I-era destroyers to the Royal Navy in exchange for 99-year leases on bases across the Western Hemisphere. Churchill was privately dismayed by the lopsided terms. His aide, Jock Colville, compared them to the relationship between the Soviet Union and Finland, a great power exploiting a weaker neighbour. Admiral Ramsay called the ships the worst destroyers I had ever seen. Many were in such poor condition that only 30 were in service by May 1941, but Churchill grasped the deal's deeper significance. It was, as he told Parliament, a decidedly unneutral act that bound America to Britain's cause. Every destroyer flying the white ensign was a link in a chain that might eventually pull America into the war. The Lend-Lease Act followed in March 1941, designated Bill H.R. 1776, with symbolic intent. The bill number evoked the year of American independence, suggesting that aiding Britain was consistent with American values of freedom. It authorized more than $50 billion in aid over the course of the war, roughly $690 billion in today's currency, with $31.4 billion flowing to Britain. Churchill called it the most unsordid act one nation had ever done for another. On February 9, 1941, in a BBC broadcast designed to strengthen American resolve, he delivered his famous appeal. "Give us the tools, and we will finish the job." It was a promise and a plea rolled into one. "Give us what we need, and we will not ask you to spill American blood." The Atlantic Charter meeting of August 1941, held secretly at Placentia Bay in Newfoundland, aboard the USS Augusta and HMS Prince of Wales, was Churchill's most ambitious attempt to forge a personal alliance with Roosevelt. It was their first wartime meeting. They had last encountered each other briefly in 1918, at a dinner in London, though Roosevelt remembered it, and Churchill apparently did not. The resulting charter set out joint principles for the post-war world: self-determination for all peoples, free trade, freedom of the seas, disarmament of aggressor nations. But Churchill had hoped for something more concrete, a signal of impending American entry into the war. Roosevelt, shrewder about his domestic constraints, offered no such commitment. Churchill returned to Britain impressed by Roosevelt's personal warmth, but disappointed by the lack of a military commitment. Harry Hopkins proved the crucial intermediary. Roosevelt's closest advisor visited London in January and February 1941 on a mission to assess whether Britain could survive and whether American aid would be wasted on a lost cause. He stayed at No. 10 Downing Street and formed a profound bond with Churchill. The two men talked late into the night, sharing whiskey and cigars, discussing strategy and philosophy. At a dinner in Glasgow, Hopkins quoted the Book of Ruth in a moment of emotional sincerity. "Whither thou goest, I will go, and where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God." Churchill wept openly. He later called Hopkins a crumbling lighthouse from which there shone the beams that led great fleets to harbour, and dubbed him Lord Root of the matter. Hopkins' report to Roosevelt concluded simply and powerfully. Churchill is the government in every sense of the word. It ended Roosevelt's doubts about backing Britain, yet privately, Churchill seethed at the pace of American movement. Jock Colville's diary, just 9 days after Churchill became Prime Minister, records a revealing moment. Considering the soothing words he always uses to America, and in particular to the President, I was somewhat taken aback when he said to me, "Here is a telegram for those bloody Yankees. Send it off tonight." During the Battle of Britain, Churchill observed acidly that the Americans' morale was very good, in applauding the valiant deeds done by others. By October 1940, he confided to Colville that he quite understood the exasperation which so many English people feel with the American attitude of criticism, combined with ineffective assistance. "But we must be patient, and we must conceal our irritation." He reportedly tore up many bad-tempered telegrams to Roosevelt, before sending more temperate replacements. The public Churchill who charmed America was not always the private Churchill who raged at American timidity. Churchill's frustration was directed not at Roosevelt personally, but at the political reality the president faced. American isolationism in 1940 and 1941 was not a fringe position. It was the dominant national sentiment, backed by formidable institutional power. The America First Committee, founded in September 1940, grew to more than 800,000 members across 450 chapters. It was the most powerful isolationist organization in American history. Its ranks included General Robert Wood of Sears Roebuck, Alice Roosevelt Longworth, Henry Ford, and most prominently, Charles Lindbergh. Senator Robert Taft openly supported the committee's positions. The famous aviator Lindbergh's celebrity drew 30,000 people to a single rally in Los Angeles. The numbers told the story of Roosevelt's constraints. In January 1941, 88% of Americans polled said they would vote to stay out of the war rather than go in. Even by the summer of 1941, with Lend-Lease flowing and American destroyers escorting convoys, almost 80% said they did not want the United States to enter the war directly. Roosevelt had won re-election in 1940 on an explicit pledge. I have said this before, but I shall say it again and again and again. Your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign wars. How narrow the margin was became starkly clear on August 12, 1941, when the House of Representatives voted to extend the military draft. The measure passed 203 to 202, a single vote. Speaker Sam Rayburn's gavel fell at a critical moment. He announced the result and immediately moved to adjourn before opponents could force reconsideration. Had the extension failed, the Army would have lost approximately 2/3 of its enlisted men and 3/4 of its officer corps just 4 months before Pearl Harbor. Draftees had been painting OHIO on barracks walls over the hill in October. They threatened to desert when their 12-month obligation expired. Even direct German aggression against American ships failed to break the political deadlock. The USS Greer was attacked by a German submarine in September 1941. The USS Kearney was torpedoed in October, killing 11 sailors, the first United States Navy combat fatalities of the war. On October 31st, the USS Reuben James was torpedoed and sunk, killing 100 of her 144 crew members. Roosevelt issued shoot-on-sight orders and declared the shooting war has started. The American public received these attacks with indifference. Congress refused to act. Churchill watched all of this with growing desperation. For 2 years, the prospect that America might never enter the war had been a real and terrifying possibility. Churchill returned to London early on December 8th and convened the War Cabinet at 12:30 in the afternoon. Japanese forces had attacked British Malaya at approximately 1 o'clock in the morning local time on December 8th, and the Japanese High Command had formally declared a state of war with Britain. The Cabinet authorized an immediate declaration of war. At 1 o'clock London time, a formal communication was dispatched to the Japanese government. Churchill personally signed the letter to the Japanese ambassador. Of this ceremonial document, Churchill later wrote with characteristic dry wit, "Some people did not like this ceremonial style. But after all, when you have to kill a man, it costs nothing to be polite." Britain's declaration came approximately 9 hours before the United States Congress voted. Roosevelt's Day of Infamy speech to Congress occurred at 12:30 in the afternoon Eastern Time, or 6:30 in the evening London time. This timing was possible because British territory had been directly attacked, and the British cabinet system permitted swift executive action, unlike the American constitutional requirement for congressional approval. Churchill addressed the House of Commons the same day. He reported his prior pledge that Britain would declare war within the hour of any Japanese attack on the United States, described the attack on Malaya, and detailed Home Office measures against Japanese nationals activated at 10:45 the previous night. He closed with a memorable image. "In the past we have had a light which flickered. In the present we have a light which flames, and in the future there will be a light which shines over all the land and sea." Churchill's instinct to travel immediately to Washington was driven by a specific fear. He worried that America, burning for revenge against Japan, would redirect its military resources to the Pacific and leave Britain to face Hitler with only Lend-Lease support. Even after Germany declared war on the United States on December 11th, removing what historian Max Hastings called Roosevelt's serious uncertainty about whether Congress would agree to fight Germany, Churchill wanted personal assurance that the Germany First strategy would hold. On December 9th, he cabled Roosevelt proposing a visit. Roosevelt initially demurred, citing the danger of German submarines. Churchill insisted. He departed London by night train on December 12th, reaching the Clyde on December 13th, where he boarded HMS Duke of York. It was a King George V-class battleship and sister ship of HMS Prince of Wales, which had been sunk by the Japanese off Malaya just 3 days earlier. The irony was not lost on anyone aboard. The crossing party included Lord Beaverbrook, Admiral Pound, Air Chief Marshal Portal, Field Marshal Dill, Averell Harriman, and Churchill's physician Sir Charles Wilson. In total, approximately 80 officers and staff accompanied the Prime Minister. The battleship, displacing 42,000 tons fully loaded, battled gale-force North Atlantic winter storms, forcing diversions via the Azores. Destroyer escorts could not keep up in the heavy seas. Churchill called it the longest week I have lived since the war began. Had the Duke of York been torpedoed, it would have decapitated the British government. The battleship arrived at Hampton Roads, Virginia, on December 22nd. The United States Navy flew Churchill to Washington's National Airport, where Roosevelt's limousine collected him. His presence was not announced until he was safely inside the White House, where he settled into the Rose Suite on the second floor and transformed it into a miniature British government headquarters. The Arcadia Conference, from December 22, 1941, to January 14, 1942, produced decisions that shaped the entire course of the war. Most critically, it confirmed the Germany First strategy. Despite Pearl Harbor making Japan the immediate enemy, both sides agreed that defeating Germany remained the primary objective. The conference established the Combined Chiefs of Staff as a permanent joint command body headquartered in Washington. It produced the Declaration by United Nations, signed January 1, 1942, by the United States, Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and 22 other nations, committing all signatories to make no separate peace. Roosevelt himself coined the term United Nations. The conference also approved study of British proposals for landings in French North Africa, the operation that would eventually become Torch. Churchill's activities during his 3-week stay were relentless. On December 23rd, he held a joint press conference with Roosevelt, climbing onto his chair so reporters could see him. On Christmas Eve, he participated in the lighting of the national Christmas tree, moved to the White House South Portico for security. On December 25th, he attended services at Foundry Methodist Church with Roosevelt. On December 26th, Churchill addressed the United States Congress, delivering a masterpiece of wartime oratory in the Senate chamber. All 96 Senate desks were filled. Supreme Court justices and cabinet officers occupied remaining seats. The gallery was packed with members' wives. 3 radio networks broadcast live. Powerful overhead lamps lit the normally dim chamber for newsreel cameras. He opened by referencing his American mother, Jenny Jerome of Brooklyn. He wished she, whose memory he cherished across the veil of years, could have been there to see. Then came the quip that broke the tension. By the way, I cannot help reflecting that if my father had been American and my mother British instead of the other way around, I might have got here on my own. Laughter rolled through the chamber. He offered sober assessment, predicting at least 18 months before the tide could turn, and warning of many disappointments and unpleasant surprises. Near the climax, he turned to Japan with a rhetorical question that drew the chamber to its feet. What kind of a people do they think we are? Is it possible that they do not realize that we shall never cease to persevere against them until they have been taught a lesson which they and the world will never forget? He closed with a vision of the Anglo-American future. It is not given to us to peer into the mysteries of the future. Still, I avow my hope and faith, sure and inviolate, that in the days to come the British and American peoples will, for their own safety and for the good of all, walk together in majesty, in justice and in peace. The speech lasted approximately 30 minutes and received multiple standing ovations. 4 days later, on December 30th, Churchill addressed the Canadian Parliament in Ottawa. Having travelled aboard Roosevelt's personal armoured train, 20,000 people lined the streets of Ottawa despite cold weather and snow. More than 2,000 politicians and officials crammed into the House of Commons chamber. The speech's most celebrated passage recalled the dark days following the fall of France. Churchill described how, when he warned the French government that Britain would fight on alone, Their generals had predicted that England would have her neck wrung like a chicken. Churchill paused, then delivered the line with devastating timing. Some chicken, mild laughter, some neck. The chamber dissolved into sustained roars of laughter and applause. Immediately after leaving the stage, photographer Yusuf Karsh captured the iconic portrait known as the Roaring Lion. He plucked Churchill's cigar from his hand just before the shutter clicked, producing the defiant expression that would define Churchill's image for posterity. The ethical dimension of Britain's reaction to Pearl Harbor requires careful consideration. Churchill was acutely aware of the moral complexity. His memoir passage begins not with triumph, but with a plea for understanding. "No American will think it wrong of me," he wrote. That opening is itself an acknowledgement that his joy could seem troubling. He was asking permission to feel what he felt. The numbers demanded solemnity. 2,403 Americans were killed at Pearl Harbor, 2,008 Navy personnel, 218 Army, 109 Marines, 68 civilians. Another 1,178 were wounded. 18 ships were sunk or run aground, including 5 battleships. The USS Arizona alone took 1,177 men to the bottom of the harbor, where most remain entombed to this day. For America, December 7th was a day of unalloyed horror. Families receiving telegrams, a nation in shock, the illusion of continental safety shattered forever. Young men who had been eating breakfast at 7:55 in the morning lay dead by 8:30. The attack lasted less than 2 hours, but transformed American consciousness permanently. For Britain, the same event carried an inescapable counter-meaning. Churchill did not disguise this. His description of his American guests, that they did not wail or lament, that they wasted no words in reproach or sorrow, that one might almost have thought they had been delivered from a long pain, is a remarkable admission of collective British relief built upon American suffering. Churchill processed this duality not through guilt, but through strategic reframing. His approach was to treat Pearl Harbor as Japan's crime, not Britain's opportunity. The distinction mattered to him. He acknowledged terrible forfeits in the East and immeasurable cost and tribulation ahead, placing British relief within a framework of shared sacrifice rather than unilateral gain. His phrase, "the sleep of the saved and thankful," carries unmistakable religious overtones of salvation through suffering that implicitly acknowledge the sacrificial nature of what had happened. His private telegram to Anthony Eden, 3 days after the attack, reveals a more sober assessment than the triumphant memoirs suggest. On December 10th, Churchill wrote that the United States had sustained a major disaster at Hawaii and now had only 2 battleships effective in the Pacific against 10 Japanese. This was not a man blind to the cost. Harriman's perspective as an American present that night adds crucial nuance. He too felt relief, writing that at least there was a future now. But he framed it differently from Churchill. For Harriman, the emotion was not jubilation, but the release of an unbearable tension. His country had been attacked, yet the attack had resolved an impossible strategic ambiguity. Within the British government, the implications of Pearl Harbor rippled outward in the following days. The Foreign Office began planning for a comprehensive alliance structure. The War Office reassessed deployment priorities. The Admiralty, despite the devastating loss of Prince of Wales and repulse 2 days later, recognized that American naval power would eventually turn the tide in both oceans. Staff officers who had been calculating how long Britain could hold out began calculating how long it would take to win. The strategic validation of Churchill's assessment came with remarkable speed. Germany's declaration of war on the United States on December 11th removed the last obstacle to full Anglo-American military cooperation against Hitler. It was a decision that baffled many observers then, and puzzles historians still. Hitler was under no treaty obligation to declare war on America simply because Japan had attacked. The Tripartite Pact bound its signatories only in case of attack, not aggression. By declaring war, Hitler handed Roosevelt precisely what Churchill had been working toward for 18 months. The United States could now fight Germany with full congressional backing and united public opinion. The transformation of American society in the weeks following Pearl Harbor vindicated everything Churchill had believed about the Pearl Harbor. Latent power of the United States. Recruiting stations were overwhelmed with volunteers. Factories that had been producing consumer goods began converting to war production. The industrial capacity that would eventually outproduce all the Axis powers combined began to mobilize. Shipyards that had been building merchant vessels started laying keels for destroyers, cruisers, and the aircraft carriers that would sweep the Imperial Japanese Navy from the Pacific. By June 1942, just 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the Battle of Midway would destroy 4 Japanese fleet carriers and permanently shift the naval balance in the Pacific. By November 1942, Operation Torch would land American troops in North Africa alongside the British. By the summer of 1943, the tide in the Atlantic would turn decisively, as American-built escort carriers and long-range aircraft closed the mid-Atlantic gap that had given U-boats their hunting ground. The evening of December 7, 1941, at Chequers was the pivot point of the 20th century. The instant when a global war that Britain was slowly losing became a war the Allies would eventually win. Churchill grasped this immediately, with an intuitive, strategic certainty that history has vindicated. His calculation that combined Allied power represented twice or even thrice that of the Axis proved essentially correct. Though the war would grind on for nearly 4 more years at a cost of tens of millions of additional lives, what makes this episode enduringly compelling is its layered emotional truth. Churchill's reaction was simultaneously strategic and personal. He was a man who had spent nearly 2 years carrying a weight that no single leader should have to bear. He had begged and charmed and occasionally raged at the most powerful nation on earth to join the fight. He had watched American sailors die on torpedoed destroyers while their countrymen remained indifferent. He had dispatched convoys across the Atlantic knowing that many of the merchant seamen aboard would never return. Now, in the cruelest possible way, the deadlock was broken. The alliance forged in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor would reshape the world. The structures created at the Arcadia Conference, the combined chiefs of staff, the principle of unified command, the commitment to unconditional surrender, would provide the framework for total Allied victory. The personal relationship between Churchill and Roosevelt, tested and deepened by 3 weeks of intimate collaboration at the White House over Christmas 1941, would anchor the grand strategy that defeated Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. Churchill's assessment that December night proved prophetic. American industrial might did produce the ships that closed the Atlantic wound. American aircraft did sweep the Luftwaffe from the skies over Europe. American landing craft did carry the armies that liberated France and drove into the heart of the Reich. The gigantic boiler, once lit, generated power beyond anything the Axis could match. On that December evening in 1941, none of this had yet happened. There was only a 67-year-old man in a country house in Buckinghamshire, listening to a crackling radio announcement and understanding in a single moment that the impossible had become possible. His nation would survive. The civilization he had pledged his life to defend would endure. The darkness that had been closing in for 2 years would eventually give way to light. He went to bed and slept soundly. The 2,400 Americans who died that day at Pearl Harbor had given their lives, unknowingly, to forge the alliance that would save the world from tyranny. Whether they would have begrudged Churchill his rest is a question history cannot answer. What we know is that the war Churchill had despaired of winning was now a war that could be won. And that knowledge, on the night of December 7th, 1941, was enough to let one exhausted leader finally close his eyes and sleep.